Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's History Room Live. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room here at the Patent Free Library. It's just upstairs. History Room Live is a monthly program, and we do our best to bring you speakers, history room collections, and workshops that aim to highlight the history of Maine and our communities. For today's program, we would like to especially thank Just Framing for their support. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you can't unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and Q&A feature. If you would like to enable closed captioning, you can just click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn them on. Our speaker is not using a PowerPoint today, so you'll just be seeing him speak, no screen sharing. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to address why we're in the reading room today rather than upstairs in our community room, where we usually meet. As you know, today's presentation is on Governor William King, and the Patent Free Library is the very proud custodian of the personal library of William King, which was purchased in 1852 by George F. Patton and John Patton, our namesake. Governor King's collection contains 534 volumes in these glass cases behind us and to our left. And we invite you to come take a look at the very special collection after today's talk. Today, I am so pleased to welcome Representative Sean Paulhus. Sean is a native of Bath and a lifelong resident. He served on the Bath City Council for many years and is currently serving his third term in the Maine House of Representatives. Sean has taken a particular interest in Governor King and actually advocated for legislation to proclaim March 16th of each year as Governor William King Day. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for coming out this morning to listen and talk about William King, our first governor. He was an important figure not only in the history of our state, but also our own community of Bath here. Before we get too far into William King, I just want to give a little background of how I got interested in William King and why we're here today. So the first time I ever heard of William King was in middle school, which at the time they were building the bridge across the Kennebec, and in our social studies class, we were talking about all the different names that were being proposed, and one of the names being proposed was William King, and so we were discussing which ones we would prefer and stuff, and for some reason at that time, even though I didn't know anything about William King, I thought that should have been the name for the bridge and advocated for it in our social studies class. Afterwards, I didn't hear anything more about William King, and kind of went on, finished high school and went to college in Ohio at Marietta College. And one day in the library, I was walking around and found the book, Maine Becomes a State by Ronald F. Banks. And from there, opened it up and started reading about how the movement to separate, and William King was all through it, and it said he was from Bath, and that caught my interest, especially since I didn't know very much about William King or had seen much about William King in our community. So when I came back from Ohio, I started doing research and looking for things about William King. Of course, I found here at the library some information and found his gravesite, but that was about all I could really find. And so from there, I kind of, with my research, I tried to bring the history of William King and his importance to our state and our community of Bath. So as mentioned, I pushed for Governor William King Day, which is March 16th, which is the day after Statehood Day, March 15th. If you go to City Hall, you'll see a portrait of Governor King in there that I donated. And recently we renamed the Customs House Square Governor William King Square, because that is where his house once stood, right where the Customs House is. So a little bit at a time, we've been bringing the name William King back to the public and knowledge. So that's kind of how I got interested in this and kind of why I'm here today, because I'm so interested in, and as the title says, William King, the George Washington of Maine. As a tour guide at the State House, I used to give tours, and there's a large portrait of William King in the Hall of Flags. And when talking to students, I would mention all the portraits, and when I came to William King, I was trying to explain, who William King was, president of the Constitutional Convention, he was first governor, all these things. And, when you're talking to school age students it's hard to kind of connect to those things. And one way I was able to kind of get them to think about it was that as George Washington was to the nation, William King was to the state of Maine and our founding. And I found that really worked with talking to the public. As George Washington led the fight to separate from Britain, William King led the political fight to separate from Massachusetts. George Washington was a president of the Constitutional Convention. William King was the president of the Constitutional Convention for the state of Maine. George Washington was our first president and helped start our government. William King was our first governor and helped start the government for the state of Maine. George Washington helped create and start the process of the nation's capital down in Washington, D.C., selecting sites and architects for the public buildings. William King, in a later capacity as Commissioner of Public Buildings, selected Charles Bulfinch and helped select the site for our first State House. So there's a lot of comparisons that really fit well between the two. I would also point out, I was just thinking about this for this talk. The portrait in the middle here, these are all portraits of William King at different times in his life, but the middle one is probably the one most people will recognize William King. We have the portrait here in the room as well. It was done by Gilbert Stuart. So the most well-known portrait of William King was done by Gilbert Stuart. The most well-known portrait of George Washington, which we see on the dollar bill, was also done by Gilbert Stuart. So that's another connection I didn't even think about until just recently. So those are kind of the connections, but today I just want to kind of go over, the life and career of William King. And I just want to start with a quote that James G. Blaine, who was U.S. Senator and former Speaker of the House, Washington, ran for president. And he said in 1878, he, more than any other person, created the state of Maine. And he was quoted at the time because Maine was donating the statue to Statuary Hall on Maine's behalf in 1878. So if you ever go down to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, in Statuary Hall, every state is given 2 statues. Our first one is of William King, and so his statue is still there. And so that quote was given when James G. Blaine was introducing the legislation to have that done. And I think it kind of encompasses how people felt at the time and really the importance of William King in the history of our state and what he brought to it. But William King, was a child of the American Revolution. He was born on February 9th, 1768 in the town of Scarborough to Richard King and his second wife, Mary Black. Now, William's father, Richard, was a fairly wealthy merchant at the time in Scarborough, probably one of the more prominent persons. And as a result, during this time in the 1760s, around the time that William was born, things were starting to heat up with the pre-revolution, like tax rebellion and everything like that. And William's father, Richard, was kind of looked on as a little bit more loyal to the crown, and so on one night in 1766, just before William's birth, a mob attacked the home and destroyed his business papers and really set the family back. So by the time William was born, the family was not at the same level as had been before. And his father would, for the next 7 years, would spend a lot of legal time and money trying to recoup a lot of the losses that were incurred because of the attack. And one of the lawyers representing William King's father, Richard, was the future second president, John Adams. And John Adams was advocating for Richard. They eventually, as with most legal things, it takes several years to get through the courts and stuff. And in 1775, they had won several cases, but with legal fees and everything, Richard King never really quite recouped those losses. And in March 1775, he died, right? Like a month before Lexington was conquered. So at 7 years old, William King was left without a father, and the family was not in the best financial straits. So William went off to work. He worked in sawmills. He basically was an apprentice in business. He never got a college education. He had an older half-brother, Rufus King. Rufus was able to get a college education, as usually first sons did. He went to Harvard. Some people might know the name Rufus King. It's not as well known today, but Rufus would go on to politics in Massachusetts. He would represent Massachusetts in the U.S. Constitutional Convention and was a signer of the U.S. Constitution, and then would become a U.S. Senator from New York and ambassador to Great Britain on several occasions. And in 1816 was actually the Federalist, I believe the last Federalist candidate for president of the United States. And so, so that was his older half brother, and was an influence on William throughout his life. So around 1790, in his early 20s, William removed from the Scarborough area and moved to Topsom. And it was in Topsom that he formed a business relationship with his brother-in-law, Dr. Benjamin Jones Porter. Some of you might know the Porter House in Topsom. That was his brother-in-law and business partner. They formed a store, Porter and King, which was located in Topsom. They also owned several sawmills across the Androscoggin River, and then eventually expanded out to trade and shipping. And this would be the start of his business career that would last for at least 50 years and would expand into banks, roads, bridges, land, trade, ships. He, at one point in his life, he was president of the first bank in Bath Bank. He was president of the Lincoln and Kennebec County Bank. He was the principal owner of the Bath Bridge and Turnpike, the first Cumberland Turnpike. He was a trustee of the Marine Insurance Company, the Hollowell Augusta Bank. So he had his fingers in many things. He was also an owner of the first cotton mill in Brunswick, and then would also be one of his ships was the first ones to enter into the cotton trade with New Orleans in the early 1800s. And then later on, he would be a large landowner in northern Maine. If you've ever been up to Kingfield, that is named after William King. He had a home up there. It's actually one of the few homes that he owned that is still standing is still up there. But he would go up there twice a year and help cultivate it and stuff. So he was a large business renaissance man, as we would say today, at that time. And of course, at that same time, as his business was going, he started getting more involved, taking the example of his older brother Rufus in politics. And so in 1795, at the age of 27, he was elected to his first state office, which was as a state representative to the Massachusetts House, but as a Federalist. At this time, Federalists were the majority party here in the District of Maine, because we were part of Massachusetts at the time. He would go on to serve 2 terms representing Topsom there. And then around 1800 is when probably the 2 most important decisions personally to William occurred. First, he decided to move from Topsom and relocate to Bath. And part of that was to expand the business, but also I think there was, at the time, I think we were around 1,000 people or so. So there was a lot more expansion and room to grow. And of course, the shipping capabilities here compared to Topsom. His business partner, Dr. Porter, stayed in Topsom and took care of the business on that end, and William expanded more in the shipping and trade side of their business. As I mentioned already, he built his house right on the location of where the current Customs House is downtown. And at the time, that was a peninsula, and that was the high point of the area, if you look at old maps. And so that's where he built his home, and that's where he would live for the next 52 years. And really, Bath and William King really became interconnected in those 50 years. Him developing many of the, like I said, the first bank, which is on the site of where Cafe Creme is now. You can see some pictures of that first building. And most of he was a trustee of the Bath Academy School. Many of the buildings and institutions that we see today, you can usually trace back to William King, either as an owner of the land in the area or promoter or trustee in the area. He also helped found some of the local churches in the area as well. So we go really deep far into his Bath connections and what he helped there. And then the second big decision that he made at the time with 1800 was he finally got married. He married Anne Fraser of Boston and brought her back to Bath. They would go on to have 2 children, a son and a daughter, and would raise their family here, right here in Bath. And then around early 1800s, William was starting to move away from the Federalist Party and moving more towards the Jeffersonian Democratic Party, which was becoming the more majority party in what is called the District of Maine. And in 1802, he ran for Congress, lost. And then in 1805, he ran for the legislature and won and became a representative for Bath in Boston. I would say that first election in Bath, he won by a real landslide by 1 vote. He only won by 1 vote. And it was contested as well, but was eventually affirmed that he was the representative. He would go on later to be elected a state senator for Lincoln County, because at the time Saginaw County didn't exist. We were part of Lincoln County, and he would serve several terms there. The major issue for him in the legislature was rights for squatters on frontier land because we were having an influx of people coming to the District of Maine and settling on land, and there was dispute about like deeds and stuff like that. So he put in some legislation that gave them more rights, like if they improved on the land and were there for a certain number of years, that they would get the right to the land. The other one was giving more rights for religious sects and stuff, because Massachusetts was a very, people like to think that, you know, because of the First Amendment and freedom of religion and stuff, that was really for the federal government. At the local level and state government, there were still laws about going, like having a majority religion and stuff. And so Massachusetts was also very not tolerant of a lot of other religious groups. And so William King put in some legislation to help give them more rights to free exercise of religion in Massachusetts. And then in 1808, he was appointed a major general of the militia, the state militia, for the new division, 11th Division of Massachusetts. He was criticized by his political opponents as going from a private to a general, and that it was just a political thing. From that time forward, he preferred to be called General King all the way for the rest of his life. Even when he was governor, he preferred to be referred to as general. And of course, this was just before the War of 1812. And during the War of 1812, really, he was in charge of the coastal defense and recruitment here in the mid-coast area. But unlike other areas during the war, this was a more difficult task because New England was against the war and had more ties and sympathy for the British because of the trade and connections there. So a lot of people and about a quarter of Maine was actually occupied by the British during this time. So about most of Washington County was occupied by the British. And so it made his job defending and getting recruitment and money and supplies from the state government in Boston, which was dominated by the Federalists, was very difficult. And it was really at this time that the feeling and the movement to separate from Massachusetts and become an independent state really gained steam. There had been that feeling for a while, but the war really brought that to a head and showed that. So once the war is concluded, William King really takes up the mantle and the leadership role, political role of getting separation in the movement pushed along. He helps create the Eastern Argus, which was the newspaper in Portland and became the mouthpiece for the separation movement and the Democratic Party, Democratic Republican Party at the time. And he forms alliances with other political leaders. He's elected to the Senate again. He runs for lieutenant governor 5 times in a 10-year span, never winning, of course, because of the dominant Federalist Party. But so in 1816, they make their first real attempt at separating from Massachusetts. There's a vote. It appears that there is enough support to separate, but then the Federalists in Massachusetts say, well, he didn't really hit the threshold that was required, and it kind of falls apart. And so the vote is discounted in 1816. And but it also, one highlight of that vote was it showed that inland was very supportive of it, but on the coast, a lot of the mercantile business people were not for statehood. And mainly because of the coasting law. And the coasting law at the time said that if you were a merchant and you were moving goods down the coast, if you bordered a state, you didn't have to go pay a toll essentially to that state. So if Maine, as a part of Massachusetts, we border all the way down to New York. And so anybody moving goods from Maine down south, we wouldn't have to pay a toll until we hit New Jersey. But if we separate and become our own state, then every state we go by, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, you're going to be going in and paying a toll. So a lot of the merchants at the time were not in favor of that. So William King realizes this, goes down to Washington. Of course, his brother is a U.S. Senator from New York. He's also friends with the Secretary of the Treasury, William Crawford, and pushes to have the coasting law changed. And they were successful in doing this in 1818. And basically what it did was create the whole East Coast one district. So you could go up and down the coast without having to pay that toll. And once this happens, the movement and push for statehood, any opposition that was had was kind of dissolved away. And so they have another vote in 1819 and it's successful. So it's several parts. So you have to vote in Massachusetts, it has to be approved. It's approved, then you have to have a constitution written. Convention is called. William King is unanimously, except for maybe one vote, selected as the president of the Constitutional Convention, which met in Portland. They write the Constitution. William is corresponding with his brother, asking for suggestions. He's writing to President Jefferson, asking for suggestions. President Jefferson gives a little draft on education portion, which is included into the Constitution of Maine. And then now at this point, our statehood bill is in Congress, and at the same time, Missouri decides to also come in to the Union as a slave state. So then our bill for statehood is kind of mixed up into that. And the person most leading the charge against Missouri is his brother, Rufus King. William is sympathetic to the cause of his brother and stuff, but eventually decides that statehood is more important for Maine and gives his support to the compromise, and eventually it passes and Maine becomes a state on March 15, 1820. And then we have our first state election in the next month in April, and he wins almost unanimously the first governor's race. This time it was a real landslide, winning 21,083 votes to 931 cast. And as first governor, the first legislature are sworn in June. So we become a state in March. First elections are in April, and then the first legislature and William King are sworn in. That first legislature met for about a month, and most of that was just setting up the government and starting, and a lot of the precedents that we deal with currently in the legislature and with the governor are started there with Governor King. And I would point out, of the top 3 state positions at the time, governor, Senate president, and the Speaker of the House, 2 of the 3 are held by Baptist citizens. William King as governor and Benjamin Ames as the first Speaker of the House. So Bath was the real headquarters of statehood and of the new state government, which I like to tell people in Augusta. And then, of course, he was, at that time, most people don't realize, at the time, governors only served 1-year terms and would serve only 1-year terms all the way into the late 1800s, when it was expanded to 2-year terms. And then in the 1960s, it was expanded to 4-year terms. So we were electing a governor every year for most of our history. He was reelected the following year, but in May, he was appointed by President James Monroe to be a commissioner on what was called the Spanish Claims Commission. And this was a 4-year appointment. And having felt that he had helped establish the foundation for our state government, he resigned his office and accepted the appointment from President Monroe. He would be, one of the reasons I found is a quote at the time to his brother Rufus saying that telling him that he was thinking about accepting this appointment. And one of them was that, I hope it gives me more time to spend with you in Washington. And so I find it a very revealing personal side of William King in that. And so he resigns and serves 4 years in Washington on this commission with Littleton Tazewell and Hugh White. And basically they're settling claims that were made towards this Spain. And this commission comes out of the treaty that was signed in 1819 when we bought Florida. And so as a part of buying Florida, we said we will take on the rights of the claims against you. And so William King and his 2 other commissioners spend the next 4 years going through hearing cases of commissions and giving money where they deem it appropriate. In 1824, he is a big supporter in the presidential election of his friend William Crawford of Georgia. This is a time when politics is starting to really change and there's really no like opposition party. Everyone's of the same party, but different regions and stuff. And William King is a big supporter of William Crawford. And unfortunately, Secretary Crawford is not successful in that end of that's when Andrew Jackson gets the majority of the electoral votes and the popular votes. John Quincy Adams is the second place person in votes. However, nobody has a majority, so then it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives picks John Quincy Adams. And so this is when the Jacksonian party comes into opposition to the Adams faction, essentially, because they're all part of the same. And William King is not a part of really either of those. So for the next 4 years, he's out of really politics. And this is when he's appointed the supervisor of public buildings and really gets involved back again here in Maine. But by this time, his being away for 4 years, his political leadership and power is kind of waned. There's new leadership growing in Maine. So he's on a statewide level, he's influential, but not to the same degree that he had when he left as governor. In 1829, he is appointed to another federal office, this time as the customs collector for Bath, which to us, that doesn't sound like a really big office, but at the time it was a major patronage position, taking in all revenue and stuff that are brought in through trade. And at the time, the federal government is only getting, the only money that the federal government makes is off of customs money coming in from trade. So this is another 4-year appointment. He is appointed by President Jackson and serves here in Bath. And at the time, we didn't have a customs house, so the customs office was in the 2nd floor of his bank, which was right again where Cafe Creme was located. He has a falling out with President Jackson over his bank policies because President Jackson decides to not recharter the second bank. And as a result, they take all the federal funds out of local banks, one of them being his bank, the BAT Bank. And as a result of his local banks go under and stuff. And so he then sides with the Whig Party. He's asked to run for governor again in 1834. But by this time, Maine is a really strong Jacksonian Democratic political state, and he loses that election for governor and never runs for office again after that. For the remaining 18 years or so, he spends time up in Kingfield and with his business, but with the economy and the tariff, there's an economic downturn in the late 1830s and 40s. His businesses are starting to shrink, and he's not able to keep up with the losses. And eventually, his house and stuff are mortgaged and has retainers on them. And he has to sell most of the land up north in the area. And by the time 1850, late 1840s, his mental decline is pretty far, and more than likely he had a form of dementia or Alzheimer's by the descriptions and stuff. And he ends up passing away on June 17th in 1852. If you look in old articles, Bath had a large parade through town to the cemetery, and you can go to the cemetery and there's a very large obelisk there on his gravesite, which the state of Maine then erected as a monument to their first governor and founder. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, in 1878, Maine sends down as their first part of the National Statuary Collection, the statue of William King, and it's there today. So that's kind of a real brief overview of quick life of William King. But anybody at this point, if anybody has any questions or thoughts or anything, I'd be more than happy to answer or talk about.
I was wondering, regard to, so Maine was part of Massachusetts, or the District of Maine was part of Massachusetts. Who drew the lines of the state? Do you know anything about it?
Well, that's a good question. The northern part of Maine, the Aroostook part, that didn't get settled. That was in dispute even during the Revolution, and then afterwards, all the way up until the 1840s with the Webster-Ashburn Treaty. And that's how the northern part was decided. The line between New Hampshire and Maine, actually William King was on a commission to help settle that line that we have between New Hampshire and Maine. As far as like down east, I'm not as familiar with that portion, but that's at least two of the sides I know. Yeah.
Did you say that, did Massachusetts have to accept our vote?
Yeah.
So within the district we voted, and then was it a whole statewide vote for Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Wow. And
Yeah.
why, what was their interest in allowing this?
I think at that point, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one reason is because the District of Maine was so Democratic Republican. I think a lot of Federalists were like, let's just cut it off. And we don't have to deal with them. And I think by that point, also just the mechanics of travel and everything was a part of that, but I think a lot of it had to do politically. And we, before the war and during, and then after the war, I think the real push was just growing exponentially. And I think at first, because if you look at the full history, there were some movements in the late 1700s to separate, but that didn't really get very far. And it really isn't until the War of 1812 that things really blossomed on that movement. But I think they just kind of realized like this is going to happen either now or another time. So I think that's why. And then part of like talking about William King and Missouri Compromise, part of that as well is like the legislation that was approved after that, accepting the separation. There essentially was a deadline saying, you know, Congress has to approve this statehood by, I forget the exact date, in March or so. And we were getting very close to that deadline. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why William King eventually came around to supporting the compromise, even though initially he was not in favor of it. And I would also point out that, so of the 7 congressional representatives that came out of the District of Maine, 5 of them voted against the Missouri Compromise. John Holmes, who would become one of our first U.S. senators, voted for it, and Mark Hill, who was from Pittsburgh, also voted for it. And they had to give defenses in the papers saying, this is why we voted for it, even though most, weren't happy with the conditions of why we came into statehood. And William King, so again, I kind of mentioned like Bath was kind of statehood headquarters, because William King was here and he was getting, if you look at his correspondence, he was getting all the correspondence from John Holmes and Mark Hill and all the people ruthless in Washington, pushing for, the different strategies of how best to get statehood through. And he, as part of that, when he came around to like, we need to do this, he said to Congressman Hill and Holmes, like, we will back you in your vote for this. So even though others didn't.
So was the principle just, we won't tolerate slave state? That was the reason not to allow it.
Yeah,
Just don't tolerate it.
that was one of them. And also, if Missouri had come in without Maine, the balance of power would have shifted. There would have been more slave states to free states. I think from his brother's standpoint, having been at the Constitutional Convention and beginning at the federal level, seeing slavery keep expanding was not something. And so as part of the compromise, you get the Missouri line that Missouri would be the only state above, I forget the latitude. But of course, that compromise only lasts until 1850s, when the Kansas-Nebraska bill that obliterates the Missouri compromise and says that was unconstitutional what they did. And so forth. Any other questions?
We have a question on Zoom.
Yeah.
From Jane. Was his house moved or destroyed? What happened to his house?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, it was both. So after he died, actually before he died, the land around the house had already been sold to the federal government. So it was already planned that they would build the federal customs house there. So after he died, they moved the house. Essentially, where if you're coming into Bath on the bridge and you take the off ramp to come into downtown Bath, pretty much right where that ramp is where they moved his house. And it became a tavern, and, it was the Shannon House at one point, and then eventually it was renamed the King's Tavern. And it was, I think 2 more floors were added to it. There's many photographs of it. And then in 1926, with the construction of the Carlton Bridge, they finally tore it down to create the opening for the bridge. Governor Owen Brewster, there's a photograph you can find in news articles at the time saying Governor Brewster comes to Bath to have the final meal at Governor King's residence before they demolish it. So there's a photograph of him sitting at the table with other officials having the last meal in Governor King's house before they demolished it, which is sad that they did do that. But so answer to both, yes, they moved it and then they eventually took it down.
And it's clearly the beginning of a new country and new states, they're extremely complex. My question to you is, could you imagine being a legislator during that time? And have you thought of it? I'm sure you thought
Yeah, no, definitely, it would have been both on a state level and federal level.
different parties, this and this, it's
There was a
just
lot of-
so-
Yeah, and especially now where like everything is, Republican and Democrat, like these are the parties, like at that time, parties were fluid. A person by the time William King was done could have been in at least five different political parties in their career, because things were just changing so much, both on a local level and then at national level. And of course, at this time, I mean, we think about the federal government, Washington and Adams and Hamilton, Jefferson, but a lot of the power at that time was really still at the legislative level, the state level. And so that's why, I think it's important to learn about William King and the establishment of our state and stuff, because our other states have been separated from other states, but I think our history and creation is very unique in that, we separated from Massachusetts, and then after a long period of time and war and everything, and then we almost lose it at the last minute because of the slavery question and stuff. And so it's a very unique creation story. And I like, William King, obviously there were other people involved, like other figures, Asher Ware, John Holmes, and John Chandler and Benjamin Ames, like these are all names that were part of and helped William King, Mark Hill. But if you read the history, the correspondence, they all took their cues and strategies from, or at least checked in with William King before making a move on this. And so that's why, he's really considered the founder of the state and of statehood. And I like to think, here's a person who didn't go to college, like created all of these businesses, created a political, establishment. Never served in federal Congress, never served in cabinet or anything like that, but he helped change literally the map of the United States. He helped stitch, not to, literally, but figuratively, literally stitched a new star into our flag, that changed forever. And so, I think for me, being a citizen in Bath and from Bath, like knowing that he did most of that work here in Bath, and he created this state that we all live in, is pretty amazing. And I also, I didn't go too far into it, but you know, he was a trustee of Bowdoin College. He helped form and create Waterville Academy, which would eventually become Colby College. He was a founding trustee of the Maine Historical Society. So, I mean, education was a big thing for him. And if you look at old maps and stuff on the Bowdoin College, you know, the chapel, the name of the chapel, original name is King's Chapel. So, his association with Bowdoin was kind of a hot and cold at times, so it was kind of fluctuated. But I just find that, you know, another thing that there's no real formal education, but still did all those things. And again, that's another connection with George Washington. George Washington, due to his father passing away at an early age, was not able to get the formal education that he always desired. And so I think in just these two examples, both at the state level and the national level, George Washington, William King, you know, we can see what, if you have the ambition and fortitude, you can accomplish great and many things.
I was curious, I'd never heard of the Democratic Republican Party.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what their focus was?
Yeah, so, so in the beginning, it was like, kind of starts with the Constitution. You have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists were in favor of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists felt they was taking away too much power from the states. And then you have Washington's administration, and it starts with the Democratic Republican Party starts with James Madison in the Congress and his opposition to Alexander Hamilton's bank and funding of the debt, assuming the debt, and it has different names, but usually historically it's the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonians, because Jefferson was a co-founder with James Madison, and then Jefferson ran for president against John Adams and became his vice president, and then ran again in 1800 and was successful. And then by the time of Jefferson's presidency, they kind of dropped the Democratic and they were just called like Republicans. But these Republicans were really the predecessor of the Democratic Party, not the Republicans that we know today. Their predecessors would have been the Whig Party, which comes a little bit later during the second realignment of political parties with Jackson's Democratic Party, and then Henry Clay's Whig Party. And there's a lot of in between there too, but there's a couple of like realignments. The first one, the Federalists, Jeffersonians, the Republican Party, and then later on the Democratic and Whig Party. And then, like I briefly mentioned, in 1824, the Federalist Party is pretty much dissolved and gone from the scene. And so really it's just the Republican Party. But within that one party, there's sectional people. And one reason why Andrew Jackson doesn't win majority of the electoral votes and popular votes is because there's like 4 or 5 candidates all running. And so you have John Quincy Adams getting most of New England and the northern, Jackson in the west and a few southerns. You got Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, getting a few votes. William Crawford also getting a few votes, the one that William King was supporting. And to complicate it, that one a little bit, William Crawford had seemed like he was like in the lead, but then just earlier on in the year, he had a stroke. And so that really pushed his stock down. And that's where like Jackson, and then, and actually, another future president who was pushing really hard for William Crawford at the time was, and kind of the campaign manager, was Martin Van Buren from New York. So, but, so 1824 is a very unique presidential election, and that one, William King was, you know, involved in. The nominating was very different. They used to, when it was Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, they used to have a congressional caucus, and that's how they would nominate. And by the time 1824 rolls around and Crawford does that, that is seen as elitist, and like we're moving more towards like later conventions of popular vote. And so, and in that one caucus that in the congressional caucus that nominates Crawford, William King got one vote for vice president. So the times were, like I said, very fluid in political terms and stuff. So I think one, it would be exciting because things are changing so quickly and stuff, but also, you know, you don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow at that time. So it would be probably frustrating if you're trying to organize things. It's harder to do. Thank you. Any other?
I was gonna say two things. One, ask one thing, two things. One, I assume you still want Carl to go to college.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And two, just because you were talking about people being successful.
Yeah.
And two, who's the second statue?
In our
DC,
government,
yeah.
it is Hannibal Hamlin, who was the other US Senator at the time, and also gave a speech honoring William King and stuff. So Hannibal Hamlin and William King, but Hannibal Hamlin wasn't added until like the 1930s. So.
You said it, but what year was he born?
He was born in 1768.
So did he participate in the war 1812?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes, he did. As a militia general, he was in charge of the defense and stuff. We didn't have any real engagements. Except for there was a, mostly on the ocean between the ships. We had the Boxer and the Enterprise, which was right off. And there is somewhere that there is possibly a William King connection to that engagement, that one of the ships he owned was the ship that I can't remember which one was going after, and then that created the engagement that started it. And then there, in 1814, there's a story about, can't think of the name, but there was a sighting of right off the Squin of the British, and there was a great call to arms, and it came up almost like the Pony Express and Paul Revere up from Pittsburgh up to Bath. William King is in his office at the bank and is told about this, and supposedly he stuck his head out the window and yelled to form arms and get the regiment put together quickly and stuff, because they were anticipating that the British would come up, and fortunately they did not. But that was one of the so he was a participant in it, but it was more difficult with like I said, with the state not being supportive. So he was really communicating with President Madison, and at the time Secretary of War Monroe would succeed Madison. So yeah. Questions? Okay. Good? Yeah.
How do you communicate? I was back, you taking a note and actually talking out.
Well,
You had to tell them.
no, it was all through letters, and it was either, you know, by horse, or a lot of times, probably the fastest way was by ship. So, and probably many, you know, because he had many ships, a lot of them would carry his mail and stuff, so. Well, yeah, and that was a major. If you look back on like the War of 1812 and those early wars, a lot of the communication with Europe and stuff, you know, took 6 weeks, so you're making, you know. That's kind of what happened with the War of 1812, like communication wasn't great, so.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Sean. That was really wonderful. I learned a lot that I didn't know. I again want to say thank you to Just Framing for supporting this program. Today's talk is the last live History Room Live program until September, but you can catch us next month for a self-guided poetry walk in honor of National Poetry Month. So stay tuned for details. And I'll just quickly add that one of our new collections that we got in this year in the History Room upstairs is 2 account books created by John Langdon Hill, who was that Paul Revere figure later in his life. So if anybody's interested, come pay us a visit. Thank you again. Have a good one.
Thank you.